I am absolutely delighted to be the moderator on this panel, our second sort of substantive panel, where we are looking at signs and instances of democratic erosion. Our first speaker is Nancy Bermeo from Nuffield College, Oxford, and Princeton University. We will pretty much have the same setup. So if you can speak for 10, 12 minutes each, and then we'll go to some questions at the end.
Thanks, Sue. I was a graduate student here years ago, and I'm pleased to have studied with Al Steppen. So I endorse what Arturo said earlier today. And I'm very, very glad to be here, and very glad to see Yale doing what it should do, and reach out to the real politics around us. Anyway, I've been in England for a long time, and my British colleagues often read papers, and it's an efficient way to get a lot said in a short amount of time, so that's what I'm going to do. How do democracies fall apart? The truth is that they never do. Falling apart implies a process devoid of will, driven by gravitational forces. But regime change is always the result of deliberate action. Democracies don't fall apart, they're taken apart by counter-elites. So, will it happen here? Do the ominous parallels between the rise of interwar fascism foretell tragedy, as people sometimes discuss in Europe? Since we can learn from success as well as failure, I'm going to trace the trajectory of failed democracy in interwar Italy and enduring democracy in interwar Finland. Putting our current democracy in comparative perspective reveals some troubling similarities and some consoling contrasts. Italy's story is one of capitalist-fascist alliance, ill-conceived invitations, and a weak defense. The hopes and fears inspired by the Bolsheviks' revolution and its success in Russia played a pivotal role in the breakdown of Italian democracy in 1922. Mussolini was spectacularly successful in using the seizure of factories and farms and the threat of revolution as a means of mobilizing support. Landowners and industrial elites joined Mussolini in common cause, and his fascist squads, manned by veterans, provided the property protections and the coercion that the new democratic order failed to provide. Together, a fascist-capitalist alliance helped undermine the liberal state. Fearing the left himself, Italy's liberal prime minister, Giolitti, invited the fascist party to join the electoral lists of the National Bloc, a coalition of parties united in opposition to socialism. The invitation gave the fascists an air of legitimacy and 6% of the seats in the legislature. It was followed by an even more consequential invitation when King Victor Emmanuel asked Mussolini to form a government. The elected elite, who should have defended Italy's democratic institutions, failed miserably. Their rampant corruption boosted disaffection and provided Mussolini with a ready audience. Key leaders simply beat a retreat as the fascists grew stronger. Giolitti himself resigned and stayed out of Rome during the entire crisis, and parliamentarians simply avoided key votes and debates. Finally, Italy's chief military commander refused to commit his forces to resistance when the king asked if he could repel Mussolini's advance. Italian democracy was left defenseless. Finland's success was based on a dearth of fascist allies, successful exclusion, and a broad defense. Finnish democracy endured the assault of a movement inspired by Italian fascism. The extreme right Lapua movement emerged when anti-communist farmers reeling from the Depression rioted in 1929, and it swept the country so quickly that the breakdown of democracy seemed a certainty. At first, political elites made concessions to the movement, passing anti-communist laws and overlooking extreme right lawlessness and violence. But by the autumn of 1930, they began to crack down. The courts meted out harsh punishments for movement violence and even convicted a leader's son of political murder. The conservative Agrarian Union Party turned decisively against the movement in 1930, Unlike its counterparts in Italy, it allied with the Social Democrats and two other moderate parties to exclude extremists and form a lawfulness front as its coalition. The Lapo movement soon lost nearly all its support from economic elites. When the movement organized a revolt in 1932, the conservative president, P.E. Svinefund, there he is, arrested its leaders and made a radio appeal urging its members to go home. As a well-known nationalist hero himself from the Civil War, who'd once had support within the movement, Svinefund might well have behaved as Victor Emmanuel did in Italy. But instead, he outlawed the movement altogether, working together. Finnish political, military, and economic elites kept Finnish democracy alive. So what does this comparison, which might seem curious here today, what does this comparison teach us? Finland's democracy endured because its political elites marshaled what I've called elsewhere something called distancing capacity. Distancing involves condemning and prosecuting all those who engage in violence or lawlessness, or, in our case, violations of the Constitution, even when they present themselves as allies. In Finland, political parties, conservative political parties, courts, and capitalists, and a conservative war hero succeeded in distancing the right from anti-democratic forces and thereby preserving the system. Now, might we see a process approximating distancing here? I'm not going to push a parallel between Svinefund and John McCain. McCain wasn't wielding presidential power when his own process of distancing began. And Trump has already been invited to rule without a king. And we see the very opposite of distancing often in Congress. This said, there might be reasons to expect more successful distancing in the future. I discussed several in the paper, but here I have time for only two. And the first involves the differing role of economic elites. Distancing was unlikely in Italy because a critical mass of fearful economic elites believed that democracy could not serve their interests. But U.S. capital has done spectacularly well under liberal democracy. They don't need any thuggery or anti-system action. They're in control of the system. We heard that this morning. Unions have been so weakened that they hardly pose a threat to profits, much less prosperity. Anarchists are few in number, and despite blatant, deadly provocations, mobilizations in defense of minority rights have involved only minimal violence, and it's rarely property-related. This is astounding. Rather than colluding with Trump, many of the most dynamic and powerful sectors of our capitalist elite have emerged to oppose his policies. They don't fear a redistributive left. Instead, they fear tariff walls that will raise their costs of production. They fear losing valuable members of their workforce because of xenophobic immigration laws. They fear losing market share if their association with Trump's racism or anti-Semitism leads to consumer boycotts. And surely many fear violating their own democratic principles. So we're not seeing a sweet capitalist alliance here. We're seeing the seeds of distancing instead. So if powerful economic elites, or some powerful economic elites, can distance themselves from Trump and anti-democratic initiatives, can political elites follow suit? Or should they, like party elites in Italy, assume that they need to support Trump and anti-democratic actions to win elections? Well, maybe distancing is impossible here. We read that moderate Republican elites are running scared and that Bannon and the Mercers are waging successful war on the Republican establishment. But a closer look at political behavior and opinion reveals that the incentives for some form of distancing might still exist. 4 observations motivate my hope with this conclusion. First, Trump might bear some resemblance to Mussolini. But I'm not sure Trump himself leads an actual movement. He has only a base, and that's different. The dynamism that we saw in the interwar years, even the dynamism we've seen more recently with leaders like Chavez or Correa, simply not there. The abysmal turnout for his inauguration provides evidence of my point. This is a movement. This is a movement. This is probably not a movement. And I'm serious. And keep in mind that Trump's charisma is not transferable. Think about past events. The people and causes he backs often fail. Trump's supposed supporters and allies have often been fickle friends, and this lowers the cost of opposing his anti-democratic initiatives. Public opinion trends provide further incentives for distancing. Positive opinions of Trump, as we heard earlier today, have been declining since January 25th. And a full 30% of Republicans, not us in this room, but 30% of Republicans say that they agree with him on few or no issues. And only a third of Republicans say that they actually like the way that Donald Trump conducts himself as president. Is this because so many Republicans stand on Trump's right? Must would-be distancers here simply shut up and move right or lose office? Well, perhaps not. Despite polarization, the proportion of Americans who deem themselves consistently conservative is still only 10%. They simply seem more numerous because they're so visible in the media and so visible in primaries. Polarization has definitely taken place. All of the literature shows us that, especially a site that Adam gave us earlier. But there's still a center. There's still a center. There's still a lot of people who aren't on the very far right. The mention of primaries and elections brings me to a second set of data that might reveal incentives for distancing. ANES data suggests that the strongest predictor of Trump votes was right-wing ideology. Not a big surprise. But if we look over time, the trends in right-wing ideology are highly volatile and actually decreasing. So there's a vulnerability there. Moreover, anti-immigrant sentiment has declined steadily and decisively. That's good news. These trends might make distancing possible if politicians can succeed in exploiting them. The third incentive for distancing is the fact that support for basic democratic institutions remains very strong here, and we heard that earlier today. The vast majority of Americans, 74%, still believe that the rights of people with unpopular views should be protected. 79% still believe that people have the right to nonviolent protest. And 89% agree that strong democracy depends on national elections that are open and fair. Even though our troubled legislature might seem to parallel Italy under Giolitti, 83% of Americans still believe that a strong democracy requires a system of checks and balances, 83%. So these data make me think that at the national level, at least, elected elites can distance themselves from Trump and marshal an effective defense of democratic institutions with public support. And if I'm right in assuming that Trump's base is largely populist and not literally fascist, the challenge of keeping mainstream parties alive is diminished. And there are all kinds of institutional reasons for that as well. The key, though, is to get a broader sector of the electorate to vote in primaries and in elections. So improving the miserable 55% turnout we had in the last election is a place to start. So a quick return to interwar comparisons will highlight my very tentative conclusion here. The actions of the most dynamic sectors of the American capital, plus at least some core aspects of American public opinion, make me think that the parallels with Finland are much stronger than those with Italy. Trump's support with key economic elites is precarious, and it's possible that their mobilization and an alliance with democracy-preserving political elites would prevent further backsliding. I'll end, though, by noting that every unhappy democracy is unhappy in its own way, and that the scripts for transitions for democracy are infinite. It's possible that identity politics or some other factor that I've neglected entirely today will enable Trump to stave off distancing and take our democracy apart. But for now, I think we should all be consoled by the contrast with interwar Italy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Our next speaker is Grzymala-Busse, and I have for years been butchering her name. So.
There's a reason why everybody calls me Anna GB. Could I have some? So I am going to be both less optimistic and more parochial than Nancy, as I usually am. And I'll offer examples rather than the kind of sophisticated analogies that she does, and talk really mostly about two countries, Poland and Hungary. And I'll try to make 3 points. The first one is to briefly describe what the rise of authoritarian populism has been like in Hungary and in Poland. 2, show you some of the institutional damage and the rewriting of history that occurs. And 3, and this is where I get really pessimistic, show you that there's been very little in the way of constraint of these processes. So first, what do these populists look like? Well, this is our friend, Viktor Orban, from the Hungarian Fidesz party, known as the Party of Young Democrats, and it basically is one of the stalwarts and the heroes of the collapse of communism in '89, but becomes a conservative populist party in the 1990s. It experiences steady gains in the 2000s. And as you can see, this is the percentage of the seats that it holds in the Hungarian parliament. It basically holds over 2/3 of the seats starting in 2010. And that will turn out to be a very important number. In Poland, you have PiS, here represented by its leader, Jarosław Kaczyński. The placement of that crown is not incidental. This is a party that is both conservative and populist from the start. And 2 years ago, it wins 38% of the vote, which gives it more than half of the seats in parliament. And the reason why these parties arise, the reason why voters plump for these authoritarian populists, is basically because of the weakness of mainstream parties. The incumbents, the socialists in Hungary, basically admit to have lied about the state of the economy. A secret tape comes to light, and they basically have, in that tape, the prime minister admits that we have, and I quote, lied day and night about how bad the state of the economy is. In Poland, similarly, you have the previous sort of centrist party that governs, Platforma, which basically starts to rely on what is known as the politics of warm water. Basically, the taps run, there's nothing really on offer from the party whatsoever, and so voters get both bored and somewhat disgusted with some taping scandals that occur. The problem is that there are no other real alternatives for the voters. It's either these populists or it's the discredited mainstream parties. So this, I would argue, is less a weakness of democracy in these countries than of basically this party competition at this particular point in time, which the populists both criticize and benefit from. Now, the significance of the populists coming to power is that the numbers that they achieved, the disgust with the mainstream parties, was so big that Fidesz gains that 2/3 of the seats, which gives it a constitutional supermajority. It is now basically free to rewrite the constitution as it sees fit. In Poland, for the first time, the governing party can govern without cumbersome coalition partners. And in Poland, having a coalition partner basically dooms the government, which gives both of these parties enormous discretion that they immediately start to make use of. And what basically follows is a set of templates. There's almost an institutional template that both of these parties follow. Once in office, there's no moderation through inclusion. Just because they start to govern, they don't become responsible governments. And they basically both start to implement this template for dismantling formal institution and of basically undermining the informal norms and values of democracy. So when it comes to formal institutions, the reason why I say there's a template is because both parties follow the exact same sequence and the exact same targets. Basically, they totally share the same pattern of both sequencing and targeting. The first target are the courts. In both cases, the parties seek to end judicial autonomy by packing the courts, restricting the domains over which they can act, imposing term limits instead of basically lifetime terms, and so on both the Supreme Court and on the lower bodies. In Hungary, one official, conveniently the wife of the number 2 party leader, becomes the person in charge of all judicial appointments at all levels of government. So it's an incredible politicization of the one main check on government power in a parliamentary system. What we see next are attacks on the media as being unpatriotic, as being fake newsy, and so on, followed by formal constraints. By basics of limiting, in some cases basically heavily taxing the media, forcing it to register, imposing regulations on what it can and can't report. The next target are civil society, ranging from non-governmental organizations to churches and universities, which now again have to undergo onerous registration requirements, are classified as foreign agents in the cases of NGOs, and so on. The whole sort of witch hunt of George Soros has to be seen in this light, right? This is basically, he becomes one of the first targets of the Hungarian government. And then the governments go after the legal framework. And here the fact that Fidesz in Hungary has this 2/3 supermajority allows it to rewrite the constitution entirely. And it rewrites the constitution in ways that not only favor it in the short term, but favor it in the long term as well. So for example, the new constitution now includes supermajority requirements on even simple legislature such as budgets, which means that even if Fidesz is ever in the opposition, it can effectively act as a veto player and a veto point on all subsequent governments that exist in Hungary. There's also, of course, gerrymandering with massive changes in the electoral laws to favor the existing party and ensure its further incumbency. And finally, in both countries, we see attempts to rule by law. So we see basically targeted and retroactive justice, where in Hungary especially, there are laws targeted at individuals and that are retroactive in their administration. But formal institutions aren't the only thing that matter in democracies. These parties also attack the informal institutions. The first thing they do is to basically exclude the political opposition. So in these parliamentary regimes, the political opposition parties have traditionally been included in all kinds of oversight and ethics committees. And it's seen sort of as an informal norm that you do that to make those committees basically give them greater legitimacy. They are now excluded from the ethics and oversight committees. The opposition basically is no longer allowed to participate in those. When it comes to the media, what now happens is that basically the government will buy large swathes of ads and of channel funding only to to media that basically favor the government. And they basically, in effect, starve other newspapers and other media of advertising revenue. There's also a total sort of abnegation of informal accountability. In Poland and Hungary, there's less worry about publishing the president's tax returns than there is about publishing the full list of donors to the political parties. A lot of those have now become entirely opaque, and we're no longer sure quite exactly who's funding these parties or how they're using, more importantly, state resources to fund themselves. And finally, what these governments have also done is to fund all kinds of friendlier organizations, all kinds of astroturfing. They have funded all kinds of funds to party allies directly from the state, violating these informal norms of basically fiduciary duty to the state. And what also happens in Poland and Hungary is sort of a politics of memory and identity, a rewriting of history to favor the current governments. So there's a rejection of the communist past and the Communist Party successors and politicians as inevitably tainted, right? In Poland, there's this whole story that the entire democracy after 1989 has been tainted by the round table agreements between the Communist Party and the opposition back in '89. That the entire democratic system is tainted by these communist leftovers that have to be extirpated. There's a division of society into good and bad. The Jarosław Kaczyński, whom you saw earlier, actually talked of a worse kind of Poles, referring to those who don't support the party. And there's the institutionalization of these. This is, this is the Hungarian House of Terror, as it's known. It's a giant museum that's erected on the site of the former Arrow Cross fascist movement's headquarters, where basically the argument is made that communism and fascism are one and the same thing. And they are both basically these taints on Hungarian history. The exhibit that you see there, of course, is Katyń, which is a reference to the murder by by the Soviet army of Polish officers during World War II. So there's also sort of, evidence of a sort of sympathetic, of casting a similar eye onto Poland as well. And as if all of this weren't enough, there's evidence that the two parties have coordinated. Their leaders have met at multiple meetings, sort of multiple 4-hour meetings held between the party leaders. They follow the same template. They support each other in the international arena. And they continually refer as having a shared vision of what Europe ought to look like and what their countries ought to look like. And here this is exemplified by, of course, a Polish right-wing newspaper cover. And basically, Orban and Kaczynski, they are defending Europe against the madness of the left-wing politics and Islamists. The two are basically equated. So what are the constraints on all this? Well, unfortunately, they're proving to be pretty weak. The EU, the European Union, which has somewhat castigated these parties, has proved largely powerless. And that's because Fidesz belongs to the European People's Party, which also counts among its members the German Christian Democrats and several other prominent parties. And that party has basically blocked sanctioning of Hungary. In turn, Hungary has blocked the sanctioning of Poland and has repeatedly said that it will veto any moves to sanction Poland. Within the countries themselves, the opposition parties are highly fragmented. They too suffer from this inability to coordinate and to offer some kind of a credible alternative to the ruling parties. And so the only two things that constrain them are basically the twofold. The first of this is that while Fidesz and PiS, while these two parties share the same commitments, it can be safely said that the Polish party has half the competence of the Hungarian one. So, the Hungarian party is basically led by a bunch of lawyers, and they have systematically done everything that a bunch of lawyers would do. They pass enabling laws, they carefully check the legislation, they cross every I and they dot every T. Oh, sorry, the other way around. This is my second language. What is that? So anyway, they're very, very careful about the process by which they enact this erosion of democracy. In Poland, in contrast, the governing party has now, for example, sent conflicting versions of the same law to the Senate and to the lower house of parliament. It's unable to keep a straight story about what's going on. It has consistently basically fallen all over itself in an attempt to erode democracy in Poland. So this is one place where the lack of competence, at least in the Polish case, may prove a constraint on their designs on democracy. The second force that has intermittently been helpful is civil society. And civil society has not been able to, for example, stop the erosion of judicial autonomy. It has not been able to stop the rewriting of the constitutions or the electoral laws. But it has, on specific occasions, been able to generate enough pressure for the government to basically hold back. And that's the case, for example, of the ever-increasing strictures on abortion laws in Poland, where there was a massive black protest of women. This is held in the rain last October that basically saw hundreds of thousands of people coming out into the streets in defense of the status quo. Or in the Hungarian case, the protests against, for example, the shutting down of the Central European University, the one sort of autonomous university left in Hungary. So there is some grounds for hope here. But unfortunately, in contrast to Nancy's eloquent, somewhat shaded optimism, the situation in Poland and Hungary is basically not looking well at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Susan Hyde.
Could leave up her paradox. Great. Giving myself a little timer here. Good morning, everyone. It's still morning. Got in the wee hours to New Haven. It's a true honor to participate in this panel and to be back here at Yale. I spent the first decade of my career here, and I taught my very first lecture from this very spot when I was a 27-year-old assistant professor. So I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to be back here. I mentioned that I'm now at UC Berkeley, which is one of the campuses that has recently experienced pretty significant efforts to bait, I think, the campus community into a reaction that will gain national and international attention. We have had quite a bit of, I guess we'll call it security, concrete barriers on campus streets, bomb squads on active duty on a regular basis, dozens, if not hundreds, of police patrolling campus events, and what appears to be lone controversial speakers in the central part of campus, surrounded by throngs of what appear to be amateur journalists armed with cell phone cameras on selfie sticks. And they are mobbing the speakers who, again, are, I think, trying to provoke a reaction. And so I mentioned that just in passing, but more generally, I want to say that I am on this panel, and my expertise comes not from a deep knowledge of specific countries as a true comparativist or a historian like the other individuals on this panel, but primarily from a focus on international relations and on international efforts to promote democracy around the world, as well as documentation of efforts by elites to resist pro-democracy pressures. So the resistance to efforts to promote democracy is something I've been interested in. I'm going to remind folks of something that I think has been on the table in much of the conversation already today and in some of the memos that were circulated in advance, which is that democracy has dominated as a globally promoted and accepted form of governance, not because it is perfect or because it, without fail, elects the best leaders or even very good leaders all of the time, but because it is supposed to be self-correcting and potentially self-enforcing. Mistakes in one electoral cycle can be corrected in subsequent electoral cycles. This is the self-correcting mechanism, and there are commonly understood expectations, already referenced several times today, for regularized behavior like periodic elections that create the conditions for citizens to enforce democracy or for other political actors to enforce democracy. The bright lines referenced by the organization sponsoring this conference, Bright Line Watch. I agree with the sentiments expressed in some of the memos, most clearly by Adam Jaworski, that history may not be a good guide to the present in the U.S. case, I struggled when I was sitting down to write this and thinking about exactly which cases I should talk about in terms of specific instances of democratic erosion. And we just don't know, I guess is or I don't know. I mean, other people on the panel probably know, but I don't know. And I use this as partial justification for my slight deviation from our assigned questions for this panel, just slightly. So it is nearly a point of faith, or was a point of faith, I guess, when I was in coursework in graduate school, that developed democracies do not die. Yet, here we are having this exact conversation. All of what follows is basically speculation. A number of reasons have already been proposed today and in the memos as to why democratic erosion might currently be at work in the U.S. And I will underscore that populism, a point already made, has at many times in history been a very useful and powerful tool for autocrats to take power through democratic means. I want to focus on and really underscore two other processes or mechanisms that I know a number of would-be autocrats have exercised in the past while seeking to make their regimes more autocratic in practice, sometimes while preserving the veneer of democracy at the same time. Both of these I can imagine being quite consequential in the U.S., and in fact were just mentioned by Anna in her remarks as well. The first is the role that the media plays, or more precisely, that shared information or common knowledge plays in allowing democracy to have these two purported advantages that I mentioned at the beginning of being self-correcting and self-enforcing. Democracies have, and I'm not just talking about media freedom or media oppression, right? There's something else afoot right now in the way in which citizens are accessing information. Democracies, as we all know, have elected many, many terrible leaders. Some of them were would-be authoritarians. Yet the general idea is that, unlike in democracy, when bad leaders can often only be ushered out via extra-constitutional means, and often through their own death or poor health, in democracy, bad leaders or bad parties can be ushered out within constitutional provisions. They're elected all the time, yet we think we can get rid of them. There are also regularly expected elections and sometimes other events that provide routine focal points for collective action in defense of democracy by either civil society, the judiciary, or other actors who are able to take relevant actions to defend democracy, although, depending on the actor, the circumstances are slightly different. I suspect we all already know this. But I summarize this logic in order to emphasize what I think most people who have written about democracy as potentially self-correcting and self-enforcing have assumed, which is basically some level of information transmission amongst the general population, or at least a sizable group of the general population, that may be lacking in the U.S. today, or that may be eroding in the U.S. today. There is some possibility, there must be some possibility for democracy to be self-correcting and democracy to be self-enforcing, for the potential of the existence of a sufficient degree of common knowledge to allow citizens not only to agree that something is wrong, but to also understand that other potentially diverse groups of citizens feel the same way and are likely to do something about it. So here I am borrowing heavily from some of the luminaries in the room, but I think it's worth emphasizing. The state of media and information consumption among citizens in the U.S. today is potentially distinctive, polarized, and doesn't require cracking down on the media for this mechanism to be less operationalized, right? That this mechanism that I'm talking about maybe is undermined by simply patterns in consumption of information. And this is speculation again, but I think these current patterns of information consumption have already undermined the ability of citizens to play their part in democracy in either voting bad leaders out of office, or perhaps more crucially, being able to play their role in self-enforcing democracy, which requires both that they value democracy and are willing to defend it against potential seizures of power by authoritarian rulers. So if a bright line were obviously crossed and there was a clear focal point, there are a few things that would also logically have to be true for self-enforcing democracy to operate, and those are the things that I think I am most worried about today. This is, again, repeating some of what and just underscoring what others have already said and what others are going to say. The current informational environment might be a symptom rather than a cause, but if it is sticky, if it is path-dependent, my concern is that it will make it very difficult in the future for these mechanisms to operate, for democracy to be self-correcting and self-enforcing on a practical level. Specific examples have already been mentioned, but we know that something like this was definitely afoot in Venezuela in the early 2000s. The polarization of information consumption by the citizenry there was extraordinarily polarized. And there was an inability of citizens to understand anything that seemed like they were experiencing the same reality. The other mechanism that I'm going to just mention briefly that we have seen before and that may be a growing concern in the U.S., but is also sometimes a potential source of hope, is the independence of the judiciary. Long-game autocrats, ones who wish to come to power and erode democracy in their country. We have seen individuals like Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua comes to mind. I would call him a long-game autocrat. He understood that the judiciary under a constitutional democracy is a constant threat to their ability to do what they want. He was elected president in 2006, I believe, without much direct manipulation of the election itself, in part because he had spent at least a decade working with his allies to ensure that the judiciary would be aligned with him and support or at least not oppose the reforms that were necessary to allow him to be elected president with a sort of small plurality of the vote. And to continue to rule indefinitely, which I think that we're seeing here. I'm not sure that we're on the cusp of that here, but the behavior of the judiciary and other actors within the judiciary and their willingness to step in to defend democracy when bright lines are crossed is something to pay attention to. And stacking the judiciary has certainly been a potential mechanism of slow and gradual democratic erosion. I'm going to, that's 10 minutes. I have lots of other things to say. I want to just mention two things very quickly. One is that one thing we have already seen is, and this started under Obama, I believe, a dramatic decline in the U.S.'s commitment to being a democracy as an example and as a supporter of democracy in other countries around the world. This is something that I have seen very acutely in my own work, and I think that can have reinforcing patterns over time that end up undermining the notion that citizens would come out to defend democracy. If we are less, if being a democracy is less part of the national identity that we all share, then I think it is less likely that citizens will come out to defend it, and that will have reinforcing implications for many other countries in the world. So to conclude, I'll just make one other point, which is that I'm sort of returned to one of the big motivating questions for the conference that we were sent, which was whether a powerful individual in one country can threaten democracy. And so I'm still not sure, right? It depends on how everyone reacts to that individual. So if at the very least is something that requires passivity on the part of the citizenry. But one point of hope is that within a democracy, within a country that already has democratic institutions, an individual or small group of individuals can also help activate the institutional constraints that are supposed to trigger self-enforcing democracy. And so thinking about who those individuals are and what they might do and how they might speak to the broader population in a way that allows people to listen across a variety of currently siloed sources of information, I think is something to devote some time and energy to going forward. Thank you.
Yes, we have Daniel Ziblatt next. I realize I've been remiss. I've not been giving people's institutional affiliations. Daniel is a professor of government at Harvard.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. My comments are going to be drawing on a book that I've just completed that's coming out in January with a title that's very similar to one of the panels, the last panel. It's called How Democracies Die. It's coming out in January with Steve Levitsky, who wanted to be here but couldn't be here. So I'm going to draw on some of the ideas from that, obviously not summarize all of the ideas. But in that book, we really draw on the lessons of 1930, some of the cases that Nancy talks about in Europe, Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, and contemporary cases as well. This really feels almost like a summit of people I've been in communication with, over the last year virtually, and seeing people's tweets and Facebook posts, and so it's really wonderful to be in the same room with everybody. So again, there's lots of things I could have talked about, but what I wanted to do was to draw on really one theme from the book, and that's a theme that John Kerry mentioned at the outset, and it invited us to think about norm breaking and how to think about norm breaking, and I wanted to kind of spend my time just giving you some remarks and thoughts on norm erosion and norm breaking. So a lot of us who look at the U.S. situation are fairly convinced, I think, that as serious a threat as Donald Trump is, the problem in American democracy runs much deeper. Donald Trump is the outcome of a long process or symptom of a deeper problem. The problems in American democracy long precede him and will probably long outlast him. So this intuition, this kind of feeling that there's something deeper wrong, really comes from, I think, partly the idea that one of the deeper sources of problems in American democracy, an indication of trouble in American democracy, is the growing intensity and frequency over the last 25 years of democratic norm breaking or norm erosion. So what is worrying is less the outright violation of democratic norms, and even in the first year of the Trump presidency, I think. And what's more worrying is the breaking of democratic norms than breaking of unwritten rules. And so we worry about this, I think, because when we look around the world and look at other countries, we know that the death of democracy is often preceded by the breaking of, in words and deeds, of democratic norms. So it's ominous, of course, when we know that political leaders and actors threaten to lock each other up, attack the free media and other neutral institutions like courts and bureaucracies. Deeds also are frightening when politicians use constitutional procedures to the hilt in a dangerous game of political escalation. These two are worrying signs. So in other countries, court packing or the impeachment of, as Beatrice mentioned, the impeachment of judges, of presidents and so on, that are often very legal. These kind of violations of democratic norms are also worrying. So I'll speak for both Steve Levitsky and I think when I say that we are both convinced that it was protected democracies historically in the U.S. and elsewhere is less the formal system of checks and balances within political systems and more often the norms underpinning these political institutions. So, of course, the U.S. political system, the checks and balances, have been pretty effective over the last 100 years, I would say. Not the last 200 years, over the last 100 years. But these checks and balances aren't self-enacting. They're only effective when reinforced and embedded in robust democratic norms. So in our book, we want to kind of dig into this idea of democratic norms and to think a bit harder about what precisely we're talking about when we talk about democratic norms. What is it that's being undermined, and why is this happening? So we think there are really two master norms that are really worth thinking about. In broad strokes, I think these two norms encompass a lot of the smaller norms that we often focus on and that we often see decaying in democracies in crisis. So one is what we can call mutual toleration, the norm of accepting the basic legitimacy of our partisan opponents, not treating them as treasonous, subversive, or otherwise beyond the pale. So I'll come back to this in a moment. So that's the first norm. The second norm is a less familiar one, perhaps, one we call the norm of institutional forbearance, or using one's institutional prerogatives with restraint, not deploying the letter of the law in ways that undermine the spirit of the law. So if you think about presidential impeachments, Senate approval of Supreme Court nominees, the filibuster, court packing, presidential pardons, if politicians use any of these prerogatives to the hilt, exploiting the letter of the law to maximum partisan gain, our system of checks and balances would quickly descend into dysfunction and chaos. So Paraguayan-style impeachment, Argentinian-style court packing, these are actually perfectly legal in the American context. So it's not the Constitution that prevents them. It's underlying norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. So institutional forbearance, again, the norm of not exercising a formal right or prerogative just because you can, this is crucial, I would argue, for democratic stability. So the question then becomes, are these norms weakening? And if so, why? So I think there are, in fact, worrying signs, as probably everyone here would agree. These norms have been quite viable in American history, but they are now being undermined. And I think driving this, as we've heard in a lot of the presentations today, is an erosion or the emergence of a particular form of partisan polarization. So Democrats and Republicans despise each other. And we all are citing the same study that Adam mentioned, where Republicans, and Democrats say 5% say they would be displeased if they marry each other in 1960. Today it's 50%. This Pew study, again, others have cited, 50% of Republicans, Democrats say they're afraid of each other. So we have not really seen this level of partisan animosity since the end of Reconstruction in the United States. I mean, we have seen this before, of course. And this kind of partisan animosity is something that is familiar to all of us who study democracies in crisis in other parts of the world. So this isn't really a traditional left-right polarization. I'm going to kind of give my own spin on this here. It's often about race, religion, and culture. It's about identity. It's about way of life. It's existential. So this particular form of polarization erodes democratic norms in the U.S. And then it does so in the following way. Norms of mutual toleration and forbearance serve essentially as the soft guardrails of democracy. They prevent normal and healthy political competition from spiraling into partisan fights to the death. And so, of course, as I've said, America hasn't always had these norms. Actually, beginning in the early 18th century, Democrats and Federalists and Republicans viewed each other as treasonous enemies. The U.S. didn't have these norms between the 1850s and the 1870s when the country descended into civil war. But beginning in the 1880s, in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans pretty broadly accepted one another as legitimate rivals and refrained from destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. So there was no impeachments, there was no successful court packing. Senators are judicious and largely refrained from acting unilaterally with presidential appointments. Presidents acted with restraint outside of wartime. So the checks and balances basically worked. But things are changing. A large faction of the Republican Party now questions the legitimacy of their partisan rivals. They describe Democrats as traitors, not real Americans. Many question whether Barack Obama was a legitimate president. So this kind of partisan animosity, if you view your enemy as an existential threat, justifies violating norms of forbearance. And if you think that your enemy is an existential threat, then you're willing to use any means necessary to remove your enemies from power. If you view your partisan rivals as a threat to your way of life, then this again justifies abandoning forbearance. So I think early signs of this were the Clinton impeachment in 1998. The Texas redistricting case in 2003 was a kind of an interesting example. the deployment of the filibuster as an obstructionist tactic, the use of government shutdowns and threat of defaults as a tool of partisan warfare, and finally, I think most egregiously, the 2016 Senate's refusal to allow President Obama to fill a Supreme Court vacancy. This was an act without precedent in the United States since 1866. So again, our democratic norms have been eroding for the last 25 years, and our goal really is to introduce these terms into our vocabulary to think about norm breaking, mutual toleration and forbearance. And their presence aids democratic survival. Their absence, it gives rise to the mere image. Their absence gives rise to a different set of norms, mutual intolerance, and instead of forbearance, constitutional hardball, where you play to the limits. So when these norms of mutual intolerance and constitutional hardball proliferate, democratic politics become unhinged, marked by no-holds-barred conflict, deadlock, and dysfunction. So, is America then on the verge of democratic collapse? I'm not so pessimistic. Outright democratic breakdown is unlikely. Our institutions are certainly more robust than they are in Hungary or Turkey. There is really no comparison. But neither, on the other hand, do we think that the checks and balances will save us. And this kind of leads to a third perspective, I think, a third scenario. Given the diagnosis, when you imagine a future for American politics, we kind of think of other countries that operate with a kind of democracy with a low-grade fever, where one that's marked by continued partisan animosity, more departures from political conventions, but most importantly, increasingly institutional warfare. In other words, politics without solid guardrails. So even if President Trump fails to consolidate authoritarian rule of some kind, I think, if we think about what kind of politics this looks like and try to imagine this in the United States, and try to imagine what does politics without guardrails look like, we can consider North Carolina today. So North Carolina is a classic purple state with a diversified economy. It's wealthier, more urban, and more educated than most other southern states. Yet despite this, or perhaps because of this, over the last 7 years, North Carolina has become what Jedediah Purdy has called a microcosm of our country's hyper-partisan politics and growing distrust. So partisan warfare is intense, constitutional hardball is rampant, these racially gerrymandered districts, the 2013 voter law, fights over stacking election boards, an effort by outgoing governor in 2016 to hamstring his successor and pack the state's executive branch. This is a glimpse of what state-level politics looks like without guardrails. And one can imagine this taking place at the national level. So I'll conclude then with this thought. Louis Brandeis once called America's states the laboratories of democracy. Today they become, in many instances, the laboratories of authoritarianism. And it's here where we can see America's future possibly. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Tim Snyder, who is a professor of history at Yale.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. Thank you all for including me in this community. As you'll know from the brief but entirely sufficient introduction, I'm not a political scientist. I speak political science, and you can test me if you want, but I'm not a political scientist. And this is going to be, I think, essential for the argument that I'm going to try to make about democracy and how we might think of what's going wrong with this thing that we're calling American democracy. So because I'm a historian, I think a lot about time. And the way that I would define the value of a democracy is as a producer of time. What democracy does is that it converts almost magically our unstoppable capacity to make mistakes into a sense of continuity about a political regime. Right? That's what democracy does. It produces a certain amount of time, and that's its virtue, but it's also democracy's vulnerability. Because if you can get to a situation, and I'm going to argue that we're getting towards one, where people start to think about time in a different way, time not as something which goes forward predictably, but time as something that loops around and makes cycles, if you get to that tipping point, that can then double down and hurt democracy. So in other words, if the thing you're calling democracy is flawed for whatever reason, in such a way that it produces a sense of doom rather than a sense of progress, at a certain point, that could be the thing which brings democracy down. Now, the only way to make this argument is to introduce time as a variable, if you insist. Time is something which can change in people's minds. In most social scientific analyses, time is in the background. We take for granted that it moves forward, that it's measurable, and so on. That is itself a historical artifact of the moment that we are in. If the question is whether we're entering another moment or not, we have to open up how we think about time and consider that that might be changing. Okay, so to make this case, I'm going to start with two methodological points about this thing we call American democracy, and then I will move to the argument about time, and then I will draw a conclusion about what this means for comparisons with the past. So methodological point number one is we should be very careful about defining the system that we have now as a democracy. When you look at it from any kind of external point of view, the fact, you ask if it's representative. Most people in this country don't vote in most elections, and those that do consistently don't have their policy preferences translated into policy. In another country, we would see both of those things as major warning signs. If what we're meant to have is a representative democracy, we take these things for granted, but it's very weird that we have registration, that we have Tuesday voting, that we have an electoral college, that the Senate is lined up the way that it does, that we have the gerrymandering, that there are 10 million American citizens who are legally disenfranchised from the system. Again, all of those things, if you looked at another case, a historical case in 1928 or a foreign country in Asia, those things would spring out at you as reasons why you're not looking at a fully democratic system. And that's not to mention the limitless money in politics, which I think an objective observer would usually mark as a sign of oligarchy. So I would characterize our system as a mixed oligarchic Republican system in which we use democracy in some parts of government as a succession principle, something like that. Now, the second methodology, why is that important? It's important because it helps to focus what we're thinking about. Because we could be asking the question, is democracy failing? All right, another way to ask that would be, is the non-democratic part of our system succeeding? To which the answer, I think, is fairly clearly yes. If our focus is on the head of state or on states, and I completely agree with this emphasis on the states, then what we can see is that the non-democratic parts of the system are doing quite well. It's the non-democratic parts of the system which permit the election of Mr. Trump. It's also the non-democratic parts of the system which create the de facto one-party rule that we have in places like North Carolina. Okay, second methodological observation has to do with the unit level, America, this thing called America. When we consider democratization as a good thing, we have no trouble imagining that democratization is an international phenomenon where actions taken in the U.S. would then have positive knock-on effects otherwise. We have to do the same thing when we consider de-democratization. We have to consider the possibility that there is a brown globalization or there is a reverse globalization, however you like, that events beyond the United States can have a material effect on the United States itself. Whether we like it or not, and most of us don't like it and prefer not to face it, we are almost certainly in a situation where the actions of a foreign government determined who our head of state is. If we were looking at another country, again, we would have no trouble saying, that means that country is not completely sovereign. We don't like to say that about ourselves, right, because we're inside the system. But given that I won't go into all of the ways that Russia affected the outcome of the election. We're learning more about them all the time. I've been writing about it for 2 years. But given that the man won by 70,000 votes scattered over 3 states, if they had any influence at all, they most likely tipped it in his favor. We don't like that thought, right, because we're Americans. But if we were looking at a different country, we would say, okay, that's a country which is tipped into some kind of half-sovereignty, which I think is accurate for us. Whether or not you accept the half-sovereignty terminology, the methodological point I want to make is that we have to consider this not just as Americanists and as comparativists, but as Susan Hyde was suggesting a different way, as students of international relations. What happens inside the United States, it doesn't just have consequences for others, it also works the other way around. And this goes right down to the technical details, for example, in Grzymala-Busse's paper about the tape scandal in Poland. right? The tape scandal in Poland took place at 2 restaurants owned by a consortium connected to a Russian mobster. Said Russian mobster is also the boss of Felix Sater, who is the person who was in charge of Bayrock, who is the person who rescued Donald Trump and made him a public figure in the United States, which leads to the earlier point about criminal takeovers of democracy. If you look abroad and beyond your own country, you will often notice phenomenon like mafia democracy, which you might not notice if you were only looking inside your own country. Okay, so those are my methodological points. I want to pick up on North Carolina because I think North Carolina suggests, I agree with you completely, suggests a way that things might be going. I'm going to characterize it in a slightly different way and return to the idea of subalterns. The subalterns in the United States, and the chief agents of identitarian politics in the United States are, of course, American whites. And the big confusion among American whites is between citizenship itself and being white. And the reason why this confusion materially matters is that when your state or your country, state in the sense of North Carolina or state in the sense of the federal government, becomes a one-party state, you don't notice that anything has happened, because you don't make the distinction between your race and the populace or the citizenry as a whole, right? So rare is the white North Carolinian, right, at least of one of the two parties, who will say, well, it's okay that my party's in power, but it's wrong that we've transformed our system into a one-party state. Now, if that can happen on the scale of a state, it can probably happen on other scales as well. And of course, then I'm going to note the first thing that, one of the important things that, in addition to the things that Daniel mentioned, that the North Carolina State Legislature does, is that it goes after its own state education system, which was once, on a world scale, remarkable, and now will not be again such unfortunately, for a very long time. Which leads me into my point about timescapes. So I want to now try to consider a number of the points that were made here and in earlier panels, for example, by Professor Przeworski, in a slightly different conceptual apparatus, one which has to do with how we think about time. Let me start with factuality, which Susan Hyde very helpfully introduced. In order to think that you're moving through time in a forward direction, you have to believe that there are facts that connect you to the world around you and to the people around you, and that the apprehension and discussion of those facts can lead to meaningful action. That is an Enlightenment assumption that probably most of us here take for granted, but which is by no means a feature of the world. It's a feature of our experience in the world, and it can be broken. If you move into a world of epistemic pluralism, where there's no longer a broad consensus, not only on the facts, but about whether, in fact, there are facts at all, then the sense of moving forward in time becomes much more difficult. Discussion becomes very difficult, as some of you might have noticed. And in addition to that, common action. The point about trust, I think, is extremely well taken. Without a sense of factuality, it's very difficult for there to be trust. So that is one thing which breaks us away, I think is breaking us away from a sense of time moving forwards. Another is a group of factors which were mentioned in earlier panels, which again I'm going to characterize in a slightly different way. You all know the literature better than me, but it seems to me the one factor, the one correlate which actually trumps whiteness or right-wing ideology when predicting a Trump vote in a county where Trump voting increased over Romney voting from 12 to 16 is reduction in levels of health, right? Not bad health, but most precisely, people whose health was getting worse at the county level tended to go significantly from Romney to Trump. And this was most significant, by the way, in 5 states that switched. And so it's a factor to which one might want to pay some attention. The Economist was quick off the mark with this, and then there was a paper a week ago in Public Library of Science by Wasfi et al. About this. And why am I mentioning this? Because it seems to me that this factor of people's lifespan shortening and voting Republican because of it, or people's health getting worse and voting Republican because of it, or at least along with it, correlates with these other things that we've been discussing. For example, lack of mobility. Right, radical income inequality means lack of mobility. That's the thing which this Chetty study has established, which I won't belabor. Likewise, lack of mobility as such is strongly related to lack of social mobility. If you're between 18 and 34 in the United States, you are most likely living with your parents. That's more likely than any other arrangement, which means that literally you have not moved. Right, lack of geographical mobility like worsening health, like shortening lifespans, like lack of social mobility, works against a sense of time, which allows you to think that time is moving forward, right? And so the timescapes start to change. Now, how does this work in politics? In politics, it can be channeled, moved, incorporated, exploited, however you prefer, by politicians who talk in terms of a different timescape. So, for example, "Make America Great Again" is a timescape which doesn't refer to a better future. It's a timescape which loops back to an unnamed and mythical past, right? So now there are studies now about what "Make America Great Again" means for Americans. For example, Taylor et al. In the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition finds, not surprisingly, that Americans define the moment when America was great in the past as the moment when they were young, right? Which is funny, but I think it's also politically very significant because it refers us to a certain political style, which I'm going to call the politics of eternity, or the government as being rather than doing. Because one of the things about youth is that government can't give it back to you, right? I mean, wherever we are on the span of like how much government should do and not do, we will generally agree that government cannot, in fact, make you young again, right? So this is funny, but it's also revealing because what I'm going to call the politics of eternity, the politics of cycling back to the past rather than imagining a future, is precisely about defining political problems in fictional terms and therefore in irresolvable terms. So if what you want out of politics is to be young again, you might keep voting for that promise, but government is not going to give it for you and can't. I will now give you a more serious example. One of the things which distinguishes white Trump voters from white Clinton voters is that a significant majority of white Trump voters and a very small minority of white Clinton voters, it's an interesting difference, a significant majority of white Trump voters believe that whites face greater racial discrimination in the United States than blacks do. Now, that is interesting, but it's also interesting politically because that's a fictional problem. If you are white and you believe that your problem is that you face greater racism than black people do, again, that is not a problem that government can solve, right? Because it's a fictional problem. Now, this is not meant to be funny. It's meant to define a different political style, a timescape in which government doesn't promise you a better future, but instead regularly, in a cyclical way, mentions the things which irritate you, which are important to you, which cannot be solved. A politics of doing rather than being. And if that seems imaginary, consider the first year of the Trump administration. There is no legislation which is going to make any of these kinds of voters, it's not going to speak to what we would regard as their interests, or even to an ideology. Right? The two major initiatives are take health insurance away from people, which is precisely interesting because it's people who needed the health insurance most who were the swing group which brought him into office. Right? That's the first one. And the second one is tax regression. Right? The second major policy initiative is tax regression, precisely taking income away from poor people and giving it to richer people. That's it. In the landscape of the first year, those are the only two things. Neither of those things can be thought of as creating a future, right? Those things, if anything, only make matters as one might see it worse. So where does this lead us to? The first thing is I'm going to referring to where Professor Przeworski ended up. It may not be that the thing we have to worry about is whether Mr. Trump will fail. I mean, I don't think he's actually after success in the normal liberal sense of the word. I think he's after failure. I don't think they intend to make policy which makes life better for their constituents. I think they're moving very consciously towards a different kind of policy. I think it's a mistake, therefore, to refer to this as populism, because in American tradition anyway, populism means you're against the elites, but you still imagine the government is going to do something for you. I think we're in a different territory. I think we're in something which is more accurately characterized as pseudo-populism, where you are against the elites, right? But you don't expect government to do anything for you. In fact, you kind of want government not to do anything, because that reinforces your beliefs about the way the world works. So where does this lead us? This is my final word. Where does this lead us on the question of comparison, right? So what I worry with when people say, well, it's it doesn't line up well to the interwar cases. There are differences between us and Nazi Germany. What I worry about that is the implicit conclusion that therefore everything's A-OK, right? Everything's not A-OK just because it's not February 1933 in Nazi Germany. I think the way to understand the comparisons is more as a source of normative action, right? I'm not going to make that case now because it's the case I made in the book on tyranny. It's not that where we are now is going to inevitably lead to Czechoslovakia in 1948 or Germany in 1933. It's that those regime changes or the witnesses to those regime changes give us useful and timely advice about how to head off regime changes in rule of law states. I think the comparisons are most useful in that way. Most useful as a general guideline that globalizations can crash. Most of our comparisons are about the first globalization crash. We're now in the middle. We're now in the middle of number 2. What I think is that we can move away from democracy. We can learn from other people while we're doing it and try to resist it, even though where we're going is going to be somewhat different. I mean, as for me, where I think we're going or where we seem to be going is something like oligarchy with just enough fascism to get by as a kind of lubricant. And the way this would look would be not so much the creation of something new, but just the dissolution of what we have. Right? And I completely agree with the point, not mobilization, but demobilization, or only very occasional mobilization, like very occasional marches, very occasional violence, but mostly demobilization, atomization. And what's worrying about that is that then, implicitly, the people who in some of these presentations were counted on to come save us, right, the economic elites, whoever they are, the economic elites can be on the same side. That you can be an economic elite, and you can think in Weimar Germany, you can be the economic, or in Italy, you can be the economic elites, and you can think rightly or wrong. You can think wrongly. We can outwit these guys. Maybe in America, you're the economic elites, and you think correctly. You can outwit these guys. But the outcome still isn't democracy, right? If you continue to have the kinds of drift that we're having, the outcome still isn't democracy. It might not be anything that has another dramatic name, but it's not necessarily democracy. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we're at this historical moment in the sense that not just that great things are at stake and that actions and institutions that we take now make a lot of difference, but also historical in the sense that the way people are thinking about time is changing. And if that tips, if we tip from one way of thinking about time to another, if I'm right that there is such a tipping point, then we're closer to dramatic change than other kinds of indicators might suggest. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for those amazing presentations. I think that probably we could retitle this whole conference, How Scared Should We Be? And this panel in particular, sort of how terrified should we be? And I think the reason we're seeing a lot of answers to that question that kind of vary across the spectrum from, completely terrified to only mildly concerned is that we really don't know. I mean, who knows? That's sort of the point. No one knows how history is going to unfold. We've certainly been surprised by it in the last year, and not just in the last year. So the answer to the question is not known. I like to tell my students, I ask them a question and I say, that's a real question, not a professor question. We really don't know. And so if you're like me at all, you go back and forth in your own mind even over the course of a day. I wake up in the morning and I think, it's going to be okay. And then by, 3 in the afternoon, I want to crawl under a pillow and just, be one of these actors who stayed away from Rome for the whole, Mussolini period. So we do have kind of a range of responses, and one of the inspirations for Bright Line Watch is that you look for signs of what is going to happen, and the last thing you want to do is see the sign in the rearview mirror. We don't want to be treating in retrospect the signs. We don't want to say, well, it really was the moment when Judge Garland didn't get a chance to be confirmed, or it was the moment when, fill in the blank, when things really became irreversible and democracy died or became severely eroded in the United States in a way that would be very, very difficult to recuperate over any meaningful time period. I have some questions. I remember that you folks are writing down questions and filtering them to Germán, who's standing over to the side. We have a few questions. I, like Arturo, am going to take some moderator prerogative and ask a few questions, but I'm mindful of not taking too much time because I know that there will be more questions from the audience and that these were highly provocative and interesting presentations. So just a few questions. For Nancy, the concept of distancing, which I took to mean, and I've taken from your earlier work, to mean that even if my ally, even if the person who I'm a elite political actor and someone who I'm in alliance with violates a critical norm or constitutional feature, I will join the effort to punish that actor. But I'm thinking about another kind of, not distancing, but let's call it constitutional action. And I'm thinking about this in part because seeing Arturo this morning, thinking about his fascinating retrospective considerations of what happened in Chile. There were moments in the sort of slow-moving debacle of Chilean politics where it went from being a long-standing democracy to being a coup and a military dictatorship that lasted for 17 years and was extremely repressive and harsh. There's this sense of, moments when, say, the Christian Democrats might have said, it's good for us if this happens, but it's a danger for Chilean democracy. So that's a slightly different concept, I think. That's putting the long-term health and viability of the constitutional order ahead of immediate partisan advantage. And I wonder whether in the cases you examined, and more to the point in American politics today, you see room for those kinds of moments of constitutional action. Anna, your presentation makes me think that Trump is Fidesz and PiS light, that we're sort of, you walk through the actions that those governments, those amazingly parallel kind of templates as you describe them, and it makes me think that we're sort of only halfway there. So the courts are politicized. Well, Melania is not making judicial appointments yet, or I guess the real equivalent would be Mrs. Pence. So the media in the United States is harassed, but there aren't really formal constraints that have been imposed for the most part yet. And the question then is, again, this issue of what are the signposts and when do you see them? In Hungary and Poland, 2010, 2015, was it predictable? Were there, forward-looking intellectuals, journalists, concerned citizens who saw these things coming, or were they really surprises? Question for this is sort of Susan and Tim, but Susan mostly. You both raise in your presentations the very important point that what we are observing is unfolding in an international context, and what we do influences what other democracies do, and likewise what they do influences what we do. And I guess I'm looking for any hope in that. So instances in which we might learn or be forewarned or take actions drawing on contemporary international events that might help with the situation here. I recall with the French election, there was some speculation that it didn't help Le Pen to have a Trump out there, that perhaps that gave some French voters pause. Daniel, I was interested in the sort of problems of lines being crossed, of norms being violated, and the examples you gave were pretty much on the Republican side. And so our colleague Jacob Hacker has written a lot about asymmetric polarization. I wonder if you think this is an asymmetric problem, or if they're symmetric, more along the lines of what Timur Kuran was talking about this morning, if there's a kind of symmetrical equilibrium that sort of a bad equilibrium that we've entered into. Tim, it's mind-blowing to think about the sort of social construction of our sense of time, and how that influences politics. On the other hand, I'm very struck by, the Make America Great Again narrative. So that means the slogan is collectively sort of doing what you say we do as individuals, thinking that there's an adolescence or a teenage period of early 20s sort of in our national, some equivalent to that in our national history, that is a moment we want to get back to. And that strikes me as setting the government up setting Trump up for, greatly disappointing his constituents for some of the exact reasons you gave. And although I take what you say that perhaps the goal is not success in the usual metrics that politicians use, such as high popularity when the next election comes around and re-election. So those are some questions. Maybe we could just get to them while people in the audience are filtering out any other written questions that you want to have asked. So Nancy, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'm delighted that you asked this question about distancing in the U.S. and whether there could possibly be a different kind of distancing here, because I was struggling with that myself as I was writing this. The kind of distancing that we saw in interwar Europe, where political elites were facing fascist parties, were engaging in violence, gave them a less ambiguous signal than we're getting here. If mobs are killing people, you know that wrong has been done. If you're talking about violations of constitutional principles or norms, that fight is much, much more ambiguous. And so distancing under those circumstances is much harder. And so, frankly, I'm still grappling with the idea that how that concept can be transferred to this kind of system. But there's no doubt that battles over constitutional norms in the courts would be a place to start. That will be an arena for distancing. But it's going to be much harder here, except that I'm assuming that money still has a huge amount of importance in U.S. politics, and that if the most dynamic sectors of our economy can get behind some sort of distancing and realize that they don't need the nationalism especially, or the xenophobia that's embodied in the particular kind of challenge we have, which doesn't involve actual killing yet, then I think that it is still possible, but that the battles may take place in the court. And that's part of a historical continuity, but not completely.
Thank you.
So, was what happened in Poland and Hungary predictable? It was. I mean, this was, this was basically the death of a democratic. This is a chronicle of a democratic death foretold, and it was predictable because the leaders were very clear on this, right? They wanted not just to remake policies, but to remake the institutions of Polish and Hungarian democracy to better serve national interests, right? This was very much, making Poland and Hungary great again. Secondly, there was precedent, right? The institutions had not been impervious to this before. There's been the politicization of the judiciary in the past. There were previous attacks on the media. This was just a much more concerted effort. And third, I think what was most important was that these are parliamentary systems. And in times past, these fairly fragile governing coalitions were kept these parties from fully exercising their prerogative. And now, in the absence of either an opposition or coalition partners, they were able to do exactly what they said they would.
Sorry. No. So Sue's question for me was what's the hope from thinking about this as an international event, both that U.S. changes are affecting other countries and that other countries are affecting the U.S. And that is a very difficult question. I have lots of things that I might say. I mean, one thing to just note is something that I don't think is a viewpoint that's going to be presented much at the conference, which is a sort of mea culpa from some of the IR scholars who are really promoting open economy politics and thinking about pro-globalization stuff, which is just that, the embedded liberal compromise that we knew about and have known about for a very long time was not successfully implemented in the U.S., and that both economically and culturally may be at fault, and is maybe something that policy prescriptions could deal with, right? That policy that others have have potentially thought about. I guess the other thing that is not really hopeful, but I think something that I skipped over in my remarks because I was out of time, which is just that when so I'm very much interested in how countries react to international pressure to look and act a certain way, right? And so some autocratic posturing that I think we are seeing now might be for short-term sort of applause and political gain rather than, some of it might sound worse than it actually is, which is not really that hopeful. But I do think that there are incentives that some leaders that we see throughout the world to act, more totalitarian, more fascist, more, they sort of take these stances that are quite extreme because they know they will get attention for taking those stances, which is not entirely good news, but I think can be interpreted as something that is maybe slightly less nefarious than the extremely clever long game autocrats that I was referencing, who are able to abide by the rules of the game right up until the moment in which they break with them, right? So I think that is in the long term, I'm more worried about that sort of strategy rather than the sort of splashy headline grabbing, attacks on the media and that sort of thing, which are consequential, but I think not quite as nefarious as some of the other strategies that one can imagine and that are harder to observe when they're happening.
Yeah, so two thoughts. One, directly on your question on asymmetric polarization. No, I think the record shows that it began on the right. People often date this to the Gingrich Revolution and kind of change tactics in Congress, and Mann and Ornstein in their work on the U.S. Congress have kind of shown this. But it's not only Republicans who are vulnerable to this. I mean, Harry Reid's use of the filibuster in the early 2000s against Bush. I mean, this is clearly another instance of this. And I guess that's what's dangerous is that it may, it doesn't, at some level, it begins on one side, but then when it escalates and it becomes a kind of spiral, that's exactly the dangerous scenario. And the dilemma, of course, is, we should stay high-minded and continue to act with forbearance in the face of somebody who's not. I mean, it's like going into a boxing ring with one hand tied behind your back. Does that really make sense? And I guess my thought on that is that as long as there are democratic channels still available, that's the way to go. I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer, but that's kind of how I think about it. I just wanted to say something also on the distancing and learning, because I think there is actually something that can be learned about other cases of distancing, and just recently in the last 2 years. I mean, what's striking about the Austrian elections last year, presidential elections, and the French presidential elections, in both cases, in the Austrian case, the Catholics didn't make it to the second round, and a lot of Catholic politicians endorsed the Green Party candidate for president. In France, Fillon endorsed the right center-right candidate endorsed Macron rather than Le Pen. And so in both cases, here's instances of distancing kind of on the right against the far right. And so we can learn from that. And I think one of the interesting things is why in these countries this has happened, whereas in the U.S. this hasn't happened. And I think part of the reason is in a multi-party system in Austria, and a two-tier, with a runoff system in France, there's a history of this. And in both instances, people in Austria, they refer back to Kurt Waldheim and say, well, we have learned from this. In France, there's the experience of Father Le Pen and dealing with Father Le Pen. And so I think, if the idea is that, the U.S., we haven't had experience with this. And there's possibility for learning. And this is kind of where, human action actually can make a difference. And people can we can learn from our mistakes. And my guess is next time around, hopefully people will have learned something, right? So there's something to learn from other cases as well as our own history.
Thank you.
Okay, so there were the question about any hopeful things internationally, and then the idea of Make America Great Again, and can that lead to disappointment? So internationally, I'm just going to take a step back and make the point that I think the winning the Cold War, both the idea and the fact, has turned out to be a very poison chalice for us. So the idea that therefore there were no alternatives, I think, stultified our political debate precisely about alternatives and made inequality much worse in this country in the last quarter century. And the reality of the end of the Cold War was also bad for us, because one of the reasons we had civil rights in the welfare state was to compete with, not so much with the Soviets, but to respond to their propaganda. And without that challenge, we drifted in another direction. So that's just by way of making oneself conscious so that one can learn things. what could we have learned? I mean, the book that I'm finishing now is about this. It's about the last 5 or 6 years, not starting from us, but starting from Russia, with the idea that most of the things which happened here, which seem surprising to us, are just more sophisticated versions of things which happened in other countries, which we didn't recognize at the time. So, I mean, here I'm 50-50. There are a lot of things we could have learned from Russia and Ukraine between 2011 and 2015, but we didn't learn any of them. And the consequence was that in 2016, in my world at least, it was the Russians and the Ukrainians who were jumping up and down saying, you know, Trump is possible, this is how it works. In other people's worlds, it would be the African Americans, but there were plenty of segments of the or the renegade Midwesterners, right? There were various demographics who said Trump was going to win, but the Russians and Ukrainians said he was going to win, and they had a reason. Now, there are positive exceptions, like Peter Pomerantsev in his book "Nothing is True, but Everything is Possible," which is, you know, on its surface a book about the media in Russia. Ends that book, which concludes in 2014, ends that book by forecasting that combination of media unreality and political authoritarianism is going to come to the UK and to the United States. And then there's Brexit, and then there's Trump. So, and then there are people like Petr Kreko in Hungary, you know, who runs Political Capital, who do studies on directed unreality, right? Foreign projections of unreality in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and those things are useful for us to read because the things that had gotten further in the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary than here, nevertheless started to turn up here in 2015. So yeah, I mean, analytically, we can definitely learn from others, and of course, civil resistance is something that we can learn from other people, right? We can swallow our pride and realize that there have been a lot of successful civil resistance movements in other countries, and that the social science on civil resistance is actually very mature. The second point on whether some of these voters will be disappointed because they imagine a better world in the past and they're not going to get it. I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. I think there will be Republican voters who will be disappointed with Trump, but that's a different set of Republican voters. There are two sets of Republican voters. There are the ones who own houses and have money in the stock market, and there are the ones who don't own houses and don't have money in the stock market. The ones who own houses are going to be disappointed when the stock market crashes. And that's not going to have anything to do with these narratives that I'm talking about. And I don't treat them as the critical block of voters because they went for Romney too, right? They didn't change anything. But these folks, the 9 million people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, or the people whose health is getting worse but voted for Trump, the people in Michigan, Wisconsin, West Virginia, and Ohio, Pennsylvania who swung the election, these folks, I don't think, can be disappointed in that way. That's my point. You know, you want to be young again, but you know at some level you're not going to be young again. You like the person who tells you you look great, but you know at some level it's not true, right? And that's how for you it's true, okay? I mean, you're like 15, but I mean, but in general, right? You know it's not true, and that's how this kind of politics works. It's not by the delivery of goods; it's by the regular delivery of affirmation as against someone else, where white Republicans become, in political science terms, the identitarian subalterns who are expecting to own the state, but what they all expect from the state is that they own it. That's it. They're not expecting that it's going to do anything for them. The other thing I want to say about Make America Great Again, that links back to the other point, is that Make America Great Again does have a specific historical referent, not for us. For us, it's about being young again. But for Mr. Trump, it's about the 1930s or the 1920s. It's a revision of the 1930s as being a time where we didn't have a welfare state and where we didn't go to war against Nazi Germany, right? That's what America First means. America First is Deutschland über alles in English. America First means we have more in common with Nazis than divides us. And there is, the fact that they commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day by saying other people suffered besides the Jews, which is like commemorating the 4th of July by talking about French independence. I mean, it's true that there are like other possible references in history, but like the holiday is for one of them. And there are a number of other examples of this, how they're trying to undo a certain American myth. And what it comes down to is that we used to think the 1930s were a bad time to be learned from. And now we're being instructed, not just in America, this is international, in Russia, Poland, Hungary, and also implicitly by the Front National in France and by the Brexit movement in Britain. We are being instructed the 1930s were a good time to which we should loop back.
Okay, I have some questions. So this is a question for Susan Hyde and Anna G.B. While the EU is powerless, not able, and willing to move effectively against democratic erosion, how successful have other regional organizations around the world been to fight forms of democratic erosion, e.g. Mercosur, AU? African Union.
Just one question at a time, shall we?
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll see how far behind we get on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's some empirical work on this that other people have done, and you know, it's very hard to separate from the international environment entirely, right? So I just don't know who asked the question, but you know, who to look at. But basically, I think that the European Union and other regional organizations, most of which in the world have a stated preference to support democracy, have some ability to do something right now, right? I mean, there's no reason why the U.S. needs to be the only country that is willing to stand in defense of democracy, and increasingly, I think others are stepping into that role. What can they do? You know, not much, but a little. They can sort of make clear that this is a value that groups of countries definitely support. I don't know that they can do anything for the U.S. specifically, the case that we're most concerned with today, but in smaller countries, they certainly have made it clear that coups are unacceptable. For example, this is already referenced. I mean, one of the biggest movements we've seen in recent memory on this front is that most countries that have coups, many of them have been pro-democracy coups, right? That they're not against democratically elected leaders, they're against basically authoritarian leaders. We've seen a few of these. But even those have been on pretty strict timelines for democratic elections following those. So, you know, we'll see. I'm not super optimistic that they're the saviors of U.S. democracy, certainly.
And I would say that, you know, the EU, which is the case I'm most familiar with, is in fact in some ways responsible for the rise of the populists, right? Because in the run-up to EU accession in 2004, there's basically this elite consensus among all mainstream parties that the EU was this fantastic good, the free market was wonderful, and free trade and everything else went together as this wonderful package. And the only parties that criticized this consensus were the populists, who at the time were getting, you know, 5% of the vote. And it's after the EU accession when it becomes apparent that, you know, maybe there was some room more for criticism. It's the populists who make hay out of every single sort of deleterious effect of free trade, of the EU, and so on. And they're the ones who then come to power on the basis of this elite consensus. And now, anytime that the EU speaks against these parties, they point to it as this is further sort of abnegation of our national self-interest that the EU is prompting. So we, you know, have to, you know, gird our loins and defend against the EU.
Okay, this is a question for the panel in general and Nancy Bermeo in particular. You say that the tendency, what can you say about the tendency of citizens to vote along personal political issues, i.e. those heavily influenced by cultural predilections, such as gun control or abortion, rather than in the interest of democratic norms?
Not much.
I'll say something.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So one thing I think that we don't fully appreciate is that at least going back to the 1930s, earliest opinion surveys, 30% of Americans are authoritarian. I mean, I think, you know, if you look at who, you know, Father Coughlin had 30% of the vote.
Yeah.
George Wallace had 30% of the vote. You know, support in opinion polls. McCarthy had up to 40% support. You know, there's a kind of strand in the electorate that, I mean, you know, this is a bit provocative. I don't have detailed, you know, attitude data, but they supported authoritarians. And so the issue is not, what, you know, is the American electorate becoming more authoritarian? The issue is how do you prevent that portion of the electorate and those tendencies from putting somebody in leadership positions? And so until 2016, we had a presidential selection system that served as a gatekeeping system and kept these kinds of dynamics out of the top leadership positions in the U.S.
If I can say a few words about that. I think the question is actually really important on whoever asked it, Hooray. Because it's forcing us. Yeah, I think you're asking us to think about these issues that seem small in our abstract discussion of democracy, but actually loom very large in the minds of individual voters. And gun control is a wonderful example of that. So political elites to really have to do more research on what makes certain issues salient and what makes certain issues trump all the other much more important issues like health care at the polls and motivate, you know, a Trump vote. But I think social science can be an answer to that first of all, identifying those voters and then targeting those voters, and in an alliance with moderate politicians, changing their minds and changing the salience of issues in people's heads. I think it can be done with the media. We're just not doing it.
So I'm going to disagree a little bit, because I think, gun control or abortion are democratic values, right? These are things that political parties have traditionally espoused. I mean, the Republican Party has espoused it. And there's nothing, there's nothing inherently wrong with being pro-life or pro-abortion, or, there's nothing non-democratic about those stances, right? I think, what I'm more concerned with is the statistic that Daniel brought up, which is that it's not just the United States. If you look at, Poland or Hungary or France in the last elections, there's a steady 35 to 40% of the electorate that is willing time and time again to plump for authoritarian, populist, right-wing, nativist, et cetera, parties. And so the question is, how do you contain that?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a question of persuading. I think it's a question of containing.
Well, I certainly don't want to say that all those positions, the abortion position, is anti-democratic. I'm just thinking about the salience of issues as someone approaches the polls. So they can say, this candidate, like Trump, for instance, this candidate is clearly anti-democratic and repulsive on many issues, but I really give priority to anti-abortion, and he appeals to be an anti-abortion candidate, so I'm going to vote for him. That's the sort of calculation that I think demands more research and more thought on the part of politicians. But it's certainly not, especially on an issue like abortion, that's not an anti-democratic issue, I think.
So this is a question for Daniel Ziblatt, but Tim Snyder might also reflect on it. How and why were those norms of mutual tolerance and forbearance built in the 1880s through the 1900s? What lessons does that period have for us today?
No, it's a tragic story, in fact, and we dig into this in our book. And this is kind of more a discovery, I have to admit, as somebody who didn't spend my life studying American politics. I think the norms of mutual toleration and forbearance were built on racial exclusion. It's the end of Reconstruction. 1890, the failure of a voting rights bill, the Lodge Act, that allowed Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans to get along. What do we do about that? I mean, at some level, I hesitate even to call these democratic norms. These are norms of stability, forbearance, and mutual toleration. So the real dilemma, I think, at some level, one can think that, the post-1965 world is one in which racial inclusion, making our political system finally democratic, really after only 1965, I would argue, has generated a backlash which now threatens those norms. And so the dilemma that Democrats face, with a small d, is how do you reconcile these things? Can a political system be built that is both democratic, inclusive, as well as one that sustains these norms? Because historically they have not. There's a tension. There's really a tension.
Yeah.
There's just following from Daniel's point, the United States undertook two experiments more or less simultaneously, and I don't think they were two experiments that go well together. The first was the experiment, which I think probably none of us would call into question, of actually trying to make the country democratic by allowing its citizens to vote. Right, 1965 is clearly an important step towards American democracy, which, again, I would emphasize American democracy is and remains an aspiration. But 1965 is an important step towards it. But not long after that, about 15 years after that, we began the experiment of inequality, which we are still in the midst of. Professor Przeworski's chart of the gap, which is from the economic policy something. That shows the gap growing from 1980 between productivity and wages, right? And the experiment that we've conducted on ourselves since 1989 about what it means when you say there are no alternatives. Those two experiments have been happening simultaneously. And so on the American left, when I talk to people on the American left, which I do now all the time, there's this constant disagreement about whether it's race or whether it's inequality. And I don't see why we have to choose between those two things. It's both. And the way they work together is that if white people feel privileged, then they react to inequality in a way which is louder and which might be more disruptive of the system than others. But the inequality to which they react is nevertheless real. right? So that the racism may be harder to get a handle on, and the inequality may be more tractable by policy instruments.
So we have lots of questions. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to do just a couple of more. So this is a question for Susan Hyde. You emphasized the demand side of the information problem, but what about the supply side? How worried should we be about state media-like sorry, I don't think I read that right. Media tendencies like Fox, and how do you compare to other cases like Venezuela or Italy? Yeah, state media tendencies. Media-like tendencies, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's an abundant, there's an abundance of information right now, right? It's not that people can't access accurate information. It's that they're self-selecting into inaccurate information. And I think one can talk about the supply side of this issue as a contributor to how we got here, but I'm not sure that it matters in terms of where we go from here, if that makes sense. So once you get into a space in which people are just unwilling to look at the same sources of information, and many people may be unwilling to consider objective information or know how to judge whether any given piece of information is objective, I feel like the demand side is just something we understand a lot less well than we understand the supply side. So because of the individual access to the internet, to lots of sources of information, and because of the lack of trust in all institutions, I think also expert institutions, right? Those individuals that might be perceived as providing expertise on any given topic, and I think that confidence in their opinions has also been undermined already. We don't trust expertise, we don't trust objectivity, we don't trust science, we don't trust, all of these things are undermined. That, to me, I mean, I feel like just the demand side is broken enough that fixing the supply side at the moment is not going to change the problem. So I'm sort of evading the question, but.
Okay, last question, and this is directed to Nancy Bermeo, but others on the panel may want to address it as well. Focuses on importance of distancing by elites, and optimism is based on the idea that U.S. democracy does not present an immediate threat via redistribution to elite interests. Yet earlier presentations, Levy-Jaworski, suggest that the lack of progressive redistribution is undermining confidence in democratic institutions. Is there an irreconcilable difference here over whether redistribution counts as a threat or an asset to American democracy?
I think there's an important distinction between redistribution and actual property seizure and revolution. And we're clearly remedying the inequality that we talked about in an earlier panel would not require revolution. It would require redistribution of the old social democratic component. And I think that folks in Silicon Valley are probably not even worried about that. I think they could handle it. And I think that, I haven't seen survey research, but maybe some of you have done it. I'd like very much to look at the values of the young entrepreneurs in the tech industry and to see whether they would in fact tolerate much more redistribution than we have. I'd love to see that data. I sense that there's probably more room there than we might anticipate, and certainly more room than there was in fascist Italy.
Any other comments on that last question?
So can I just,
Yes.
So, I mean, the whole universal basic income movement is really coming out of Silicon Valley.
There you go.
Entrepreneurs who are funding the experiments, and on the other hand, they're very libertarian. So, it's not a social democratic move.
No, but it just falls short of revolution, and it falls short of backing anti-democratic action on the part of Trump. So,
Support for your point.
yeah.
But it's basically buying social
Keep it
peace.
Sure.
Well, I want to thank our panelists very much for a fascinating session.